Yeah, I'm delighted to be here again and have the opportunity to talk to Romesh about his work. We've been talking a lot about islands in the last few days, island cultures, island nations, islands as the imaginative repositories for writing, as land masses framed by the sea, and islands as worlds, to refer to the title of, indirectly, to Sam Selvon's second novel, An Island is a World. Islands as porous spaces where the sea can encroach and destroy, change the shape of the land. Romesh, as I'm sure you'll all know, is a much acclaimed writer of fiction. He's frequently been fired, and I hope I'm right in saying this, by the notion of the island space, whether writing about his own childhood home island of Sri Lanka, just off the mainland of India, and contained within what one might call an Indian Ocean diasporic geography, as well as his creation of fictional islands, sometimes historical, as in his 2014 novel Prisoner of Paradise, set in Mauritius in the early 19th century, dystopias, as in Heaven Edge, and stories about migrant Sri Lankan characters caught to some degree within islands in the multicultural contemporary city of London. Romesh was born, as Nicholas has sort of alluded to, this in Sri Lanka in 1954, where he lived till the 1960s before moving to the Philippines and later on to Liverpool, where he studied, and then to London. His first collection of short stories, Monkfish Moon, was published in 1992 to much acclaim, followed by Reef, shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 94. He's been the recipient of several other major literary awards and accolades over the past 25 years. He's published 4 other award-winning novels: The Sandglass, 98, Heaven's Edge, 1992, The Match, 2006, and The Prisoner of Paradise, 2012. And most recently, a very powerful cycle of short stories set in the aftermath of 26 years of civil war in Sri Lanka, Noontide Toll, which appeared in 2014. And Romesh is going to be reading from these works as we talk. So Romesh, obviously islands have been a potent reservoir for you, and obviously islands are potent across literary history in many parts of the world, whether in the Odyssey, John Donne, Omeros by Derek Walcott, George Lamming, and so many others. Your epigraph to Reef comes from Shakespeare's The Tempest, I believe, of his bones are coral made. Would you like to begin by telling us a little bit about why the island has been such an inspiration for your work? I know you grew up on an island, but there's much more than this, I think.
I guess there is, but first of all, let me just check the mic. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And first of all, thank you very much to Nicholas and Marina and Bocas for bringing me to this island, Trinidad. Very happy to be here and to hear new voices. Last night's readings were fantastic, I think. If anybody who was there, give them a round of applause. I think that was really great.
Yeah, it was really brilliant.
And yeah, so islands are, I mean, to me, islands are not what I thought about when I was writing, put it that way. For me, the island, I suppose, is, artistically, it's obvious, you know, for any writer, you know, the main island is this one, a book, the island you go to when you read a book. The notion of something contained in one place is really interesting, especially for a writer, because that's what books are. They're contained within these covers. It's places you go to. I love the idea that I remember when I talk about Heaven's Edge, which is set in a sort of imaginary island, I like to think that that's an island you can only go through words. You can't buy a ticket to there. You can buy a book and get there. So that notion is really interesting to me. And I suppose when I started out writing, and maybe we'll come to this later as well, but I was writing about, when I was in London, I suppose I started writing quite a lot. And maybe it is very much Sam Selvon is there behind us, because I was writing about lonely Londoners, if you like, in effect, as we all do. Until people still are. Until something happened with one of my stories back in the 1980s, when I was writing about a lonely Londoner wanting to go back. And all those issues that we talk about moving places, dislocation, migration, racism, all of those issues are around. But they kind of paled into insignificance to some extent in the middle of this story, because I was writing it, and as I was coming to the end of this story, something happened in Sri Lanka, which was 6,000 miles away, which was an expression, I suppose you could say, you could describe it in all sorts of ways. People talk about pogroms, people talk about communal violence, rioting, but it was a kind of racism that was expressed in a rather horrible, violent form. Thousands of people died. Thousands of people were, burnt out of their houses and so on. And as a writer, writing a little story about a man wanting to go home, I felt it had to engage with that kind of world. And that island then kind of exploded into something else where I begin to think, really, the island is the world.
Yeah.
And everything else is smaller bits within that.
I mean, islands are infinitely translatable spaces.
Yeah.
They hover, they shift, they change, they're fluid.
Yeah.
So, I mean, your first novel, Reef, in a sense, is playing on that metaphor all the way through, about how the island can be dissolved.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
reef
Yeah.
changes. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, there are lots of writers here. You all know that when you start off to write something, you think of one thing, what you end up is something usually quite different. With the book Reef, which I don't have a copy here, but I don't think I sort of started off with some grand idea about coral reefs or islands. I was really writing a story about somebody growing up. I was actually writing a story about a power relationship between somebody who was subservient and a dominant figure. As it turned out, it turned out to be a man in Sri Lanka, a bachelor, and his servant. And the story is told from the point of view of the servant. But it turned out this man became, in my head, a marine biologist. I'm not a marine biologist. I didn't know anything about it all. But it was set at a moment in history when things were changing socially in Sri Lanka, not what happened in the 1980s. This was set in the late 1960s, before another kind of watershed moment, a political upheaval. But what got me interested in the island idea was my character, Mr. Salgado, who was a marine biologist, but not a very good one. He was one of those obsessive people who couldn't quite get his obsession right. And he gets obsessed with a woman and so on. But it turns out, I suppose, I mean, I wrote about this and I started writing. Mr. Salgado looks up coral reefs and what's happening. And back in the 1960s, people knew very little about coral reefs. Amazingly, they knew very, very little. And at one point, I remember, I mean, I don't do a huge amount of research. I try to find subjects where there isn't a lot of research to be done. And in 1969, I think, 1970, when that book is set, I read everything I could find that was published up to then on coral reefs. And there wasn't much. And there were conferences, I could read conference papers, I could see the same images going, the same actual bits of research appearing in different conference papers and so on. But people were beginning to become aware that coral reefs were vulnerable and they may easily die. But no one quite knew what would happen as a result. And as it turned out, of course, the results can be devastating, as it was in the tsunami, which hit Sri Lanka very badly and hit that south coast where the coral reef had been very badly destroyed by economic activity, put it that way. So that's how it kind of worked out.
But it's also about, as you were saying, this relationship between Mr. Salgado and Triton, the narrator. So that's very interesting, and it's kind of very as the novel progresses, a very down-to-earth relationship.
It is.
Amidst this metaphor of the reef and the island and the changing world of Sri Lanka.
And I suppose it's also to do with dependency. There's a dependency between the two of them, the powerful and the not so powerful. I mean, these were things that I kind of thought about. I remember thinking, who on earth would be interested in a story about a servant boy in Sri Lanka from a bygone age? But I remember it was soon after that, actually, there was that book written by, in effect, the servant at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
Remember all about Lady Di and everyone. And it became a huge thing, and suddenly everyone's talking about the servant's role, as it were. But yeah, the erosion of that, the balance between the two, those were the things that I was interested in. Yeah. Did you want me to read
a little
something?
bit from that?
I mean,
Yeah.
what I thought-
Have you got something from there?
Yeah, I got that little
Okay,
page.
okay.
I mean, Reef is a very slim novel. This makes it look even slimmer, actually. There's not much more to it than this. But I thought, I normally would read a couple of other scenes. I mean, that's a novel which I thought was a tremendously sad book when I was writing it. And I didn't realize it was a comic novel until in those days before people had social media, people actually used to write letters. And I remember getting a letter from someone saying they read Reef on the bus and couldn't stop laughing. And I was thinking, what are they laughing about, But I later realized that I had lots of jokes of my own, which suddenly were not my own. I realized other people got them. But I thought I'd read a little bit, just a short paragraph to give you a flavor from towards the end of the book when Triton, he's the narrator, he's a servant boy who doesn't even have his own name. He's given a name, Triton, which turns out is really quite appropriate. Triton is the god of, comes out of the sea, the human voice, which is very much to me, then worked out, after I'd written the book and everything else, worked out that is the metaphor here. It is the writer finding his voice, the narrator finding their voice, the book finding its own voice. And even, these things happen by accident. So even the Shakespeare quote, I was looking desperately, I thought my first book ought to have a nice thing at the beginning. I didn't think that actually it's a bit risky putting Shakespeare at the beginning of your first book. But I was really desperate. It was probably the last week before publication, and I was on the tube on the Piccadilly line. And I was thinking about it. I looked up, and in those days they had poems on the underground. Wonderful idea, poems on. They should have poems on everything. But there it was, Ariel's song in there, and the first line that was of his coral, of his bones were coral made. And I thought, that's it. And so it went straight in just before it went to the printers. I had not been to a coral reef when I was writing this book. It was only in the last months I did manage to do some snorkeling by accident, not on the Piccadilly line, but further away. But I'd never been scuba diving. And actually, I only went scuba diving here when I came 25 years ago, a year after I think the book had been published. And we went to Tobago, and I did a little 5-day course in scuba diving. I went scuba diving. I should have done it 2 years earlier when I was writing this book. But there's only one reference to scuba diving, and I'm going to read it here. So it kind of worked out. I'll just stand up so you can see me when I'm reading it. It's just a little bit. This is when eventually these two characters have ended up in London. And they're talking a little bit about what had happened and what brought them here. But I'll just read the paragraph about the coral reef. And Mr. Salgado is saying to Triton, you remember all one ocean, no? The debris of one mind floats to another. The same little polyp grows the idea in another head. He smiled and touched my head. But these gatherings are full of people who see the world in a different way now. They carry a lot of heavy equipment, suntan oil, scuba tanks. They're only concerned with the how, not the why. I belong to another world. Even Darwin searched his desk for a pen more than the seabed, you know. He relied on reports, talks, gossip. He looked into himself. In our minds, we have swum in the same sea. Do you understand? An imagined world. The one time I swam, Triton thought, this is Triton saying, the one time I swam out to Mr. Salgado's reef, I was frightened by the exuberance. The shallow water seethed with creatures, flickering eyes, whirling tails, fish of 100 colors, darting, digging, sea snakes, sea slugs, tentacles sprouting, grasping everywhere. It was a jungle of writhing shapes, magnified and distorted, growing at every move, looming out of the unknown, startling in its sudden brilliance. It was primal. I was slowly beginning to see that everything was perpetually devouring its surroundings. Mr. Salgado shook his head. You know, I should have done something with my bay. I used to think in a month or two, I could have made it into a sanctuary, a marine park. I used to plan it in my head. I'd build a jetty, a safe marina for little glass-bottom boats, some outriggers with red sails, maybe a floating restaurant. Can you imagine that, Triton? You could cook there. Red crab claws in black bean sauce or something. Red snapper, big as your arm. Shark fin. We could have shown the world something then. Something really fabulous. I looked at him. Let's do it here. Let's open a restaurant here in London. And that's what Triton ends up doing.
So that whole thing about the sea as a metaphor, which you've just read, also relates in a way to the politics. And as you were alluding a bit earlier in one of your earlier stories, there's always politics, both explicit and implicit in your work. And although here we're talking about the metaphor of the sea and the relationship between Triton and Salgado, Triton is very much a natural philosopher.
Yeah.
And he says at one point, I was learning that human history is always a story of somebody's diaspora, a struggle between those who expel, repel, or curtail, possess, divide, and rule, and those who keep the flame alive from night to night, mouth to mouth, etc., etc. So one of the things I find fascinating about your work is that you manage to keep this balance between dealing with these political issues and at the same time using these much broader and universal metaphors. And I wanted to turn now to the book you were talking about, Prisoner of Paradise, because that's quite a different book, I think, in a way, in that it's set in Mauritius in 1825. It kind of relates in some ways to the kind of Indian Ocean diaspora, the indenture system, slavery. In some ways links to the kind of history in Trinidad. And you have this sort of romanticized, almost Orientalist character, Lucy, going out there. Would you like to talk about that and why it's the Prisoner of Paradise?
Okay, this book is, that's the book. That's Lucy on the front cover. That's a chap there called Don on the back cover. They're looking in opposite directions. Tells you something about what's going on in the book. I mean, books for me tend to come from one follows the other in some odd sort of way, as a sort of almost a reaction. So the book I wrote before that was a book called Heaven's Edge. And that, as Sushella said, is a sort of dystopian, futuristic book in a very bad world. Things have gone very badly wrong. Oddly enough, it was going to be my happy book. Because the reaction was the one before that was a book called The Sandglass, which begins with a death, a funeral, and it's all about mortality and very serious stuff like that, in a funny sort of way. So this was going to be the one with a happy ending, and Heaven's Edge actually had a kind of happy ending until just before it went to the printers, when it changed its tone completely, which my publishers, I think, got a bit upset about. But that was totally invented. So I wanted, in the next book, I thought, I don't want to invent everything. And I wanted to have a more contained world, an island, in effect. And actually, by chance, we were there in
I know, we went
Mauritius.
to Mauritius to an islands conference, didn't we?
We went to a conference.
98 or something. Was it
Way
before?
back, yeah. And I read somewhere one day there that on this island, back in the 1800s, when the British took over the island from the French, 1810, I think, they started planning for what to do when the economic systems changed, and particularly, obviously, to do with slavery and the economic factors there. And I discovered that there was Indian slavery, not indentured labor, Indian slavery in Mauritius for a long time. And there were equivalent numbers, really, of African slaves and Indian slaves. And the system was exactly the same. The way people were brought, the way people were, the conditions they lived in, all of that was the same on the sugar plantations and so on. And it's a period of history that isn't talked about, written about, discussed, because it very soon changed. And in the 1830s, you had indentured labor from India, which everyone here is very familiar with that history. And it's a big history, and it's huge numbers of people. And therefore, the slave period, I suppose, is completely forgotten. But along with that slavery, I discovered that the British used Mauritius as a place for political prisoners. And they had political prisoners, particularly from what was then Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And I was fascinated by the fact that there was a very key figure from Sri Lankan history brought to Mauritius for the last days of his life, and he was a prisoner there. But he was a prisoner of the kind of prisoner we all want to be. You know, he had the freedom of the island, he had a house, he had servants, he had an interpreter. He was called to tea in the big grand houses, the governor's house and so on. He didn't speak English. He would come to tea, and he and his little entourage would put on a little concert, and they would sing very badly, and everybody would, try not to listen. But all of this is only reported in about 2 paragraphs of one tiny little book that the governor's wife wrote. There's nothing else to go on. So research-wise, it was really just down my street. And I wanted to write a book about that, but in the end, actually, I wasn't interested in that particular story, and I got very interested in the character I brought from England, a young girl of 19, Lucy, who comes there like one of Dickens' orphan children because her parents have died. She comes to live with her aunt. And she comes, yes, with a lot of Orientalist stuff in her head because she's 19, it's 1820 in England, or 25. And that's what young girls did. They read these racy books about Oriental princes. Actually, they read 50 Shades of Grey of its time. And it's a book called Lalla Rookh. And Lalla Rookh was written by an Irishman, and it's a mixture of poems and stories, and it's about this young princess who is captured by a prince pretending to be a poet or something like that. And there's lots of sort of...
Don, that's his name, is it Don?
Well, in the original Lalla Rookh, it's I can't
a different name.
I can't remember the names, but there's a lot of S&M and all of that sort of stuff. But all young women were reading it. It was the bestseller of its time, which then, of course, disappeared immediately. No one knows anything about it anymore. So I brought her to Mauritius, and she meets Don, a rather flamboyant interpreter of the prince from Sri Lanka. And they, in a sense, learn about each other. I won't tell you much more about the story, but there's tragedy, there's comedy. And there's love.
And it's also set, I mean, again, talking about the politics hovering all the time in your fiction against the it's not really an underbelly. I mean, it's right alongside the,
Well,
the
that's what
kind of
was
racial and political unrest that is brewing there.
What was so interesting about Mauritius,
Yeah.
and you remember this
Yeah.
as well, is that it's one of the few places on the planet which doesn't have, if you like, an indigenous population. It was a rock. And then, so nobody has a prior claim. Everybody's there who's come, has been an invader of some sort of each other. And so the history is really interesting. And then you have these different things. And you had, in 1825, you had people who were enslaved from Africa and from India, but you also had free people from both countries. So Lucy stays with her aunt and uncle who, in a lovely house, but the landlord actually is an Indian who's a merchant there. And then there's a freed slave African who's there. And again, historically, it's a very interesting time. There were scientists, there were agriculturalists, there was a lot of science going on. So I found it very interesting, and I found it very interesting to navigate it through Lucy's eyes.
And her aunt actually comes from the West Indies, doesn't she?
Well,
and doesn't
yes,
want to go
yes.
to England, but wants to go to
Yes.
Mauritius.
Well, I mean, that was
No.
the system. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the same foreign office system now,
Yeah.
if you like, where
Yeah.
people get posted around.
Yeah.
And you find,
So the
actually, at that
connections-
point, West Indies, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, these were kind of places that a certain level of administrative class would go around and round. The others would go to Canada and Australia and places like that.
Okay, I want to jump back now to an earlier novel called The Match, which in some way also relates to Trinidad in that it's got a lot to do with
I
cricket.
know there's a lot.
There's a lot more-
I'm actually a Trinidadian.
Yeah.
So, but pretend to be otherwise.
And it was published in 2006, quite soon after the tsunami had created more havoc on the island of Sri Lanka, which was already suffering from the trauma of a long and violent civil war. It focuses on cricket, and I think it was partly inspired, but you will tell us more, by C.L.R. James's famous book, Beyond the Boundary, and or at least the relationship between
Oh, yeah.
cricket, empire, independence, and cricket as a larger metaphor.
Mhm.
So would you like to talk about The Match?
I think the books I'd been writing, even Prisoner of Paradise brings in the Sri Lankan connection. But a lot of them, I suppose, have had to deal with this central thing that, in a sense, politicized my fiction to some extent, though I don't see myself as a political writer. And in my early books, I remember, because Sri Lanka had come up as a political issue, because there was this communal violence, the beginnings of a war which lasted for nearly 30 years, and a lot of hostility, aggravation, a lot of bad things going on, bad air, if you like, and a lot of killing, a lot of violence, a lot of violence that I, as a person who was born in the 1950s, grew up in the 60s, 70s, kind of thought that level of violence had disappeared. Of course, now we know that level of violence has come back in a big way in the world. But, it was a big thing for me. So even, that story I was talking about, which I started writing in the 1980s, was eventually one that was in my first book. It's called The Storm Petrel. And since then, I suppose a lot of my writing, not out of a particular plan, but have had to deal with this political issue of how people turn into these violent creatures and why they end up doing the things they do and why is the world the way it is. And using, I suppose, the sort of picture that you have in a society, in a country like Sri Lanka, in that island, in that laboratory, if you like. But one of the better stories about that period, anyway, was a Sri Lankan cricket story, because in 1996, they became, world champions. It seemed like out of nowhere, and suddenly cricket became a thing that, Sri Lanka was really good at, and it was this other kind of reputation. On the one hand, you had one where, if you mentioned the word Sri Lanka, the image that came at that time was of violence, and then there was the cricket. And, I have a great I'm not a cricketer, but I have a great indebtedness, not least because after Sri Lankan cricket became so famous, people in England had no problem with Sri Lankan names. People who could not get my name out of their mouths, Gunesekera, which I can't either, understandable. And the Sri Lankan names can be very, very long and difficult. But you suddenly had cricket commentators on the BBC who could put out, Sri Lankan cricketers' name just like that, perfectly. So it became normalized, if you like. And I wanted to write a story where cricket was not just an episode, but somehow metaphorically important, because I didn't think anyone had done that anywhere, actually. And I thought it was going to happen soon, and I wanted to do it. I think I did it a little bit too early, actually, because now there are lots of cricket novels around.
That's true.
But when The Match came out, there weren't any before that, other than the sort of P.G. Woodhouse type cricket novel, the lighter sort of thing. And I just got very interested in, C.R. James has wonderful essays on cricket as an art. Mm-hmm. And they are fabulous essays where he basically says cricket, is like Greek tragedy in every aspect. It's a spectacle. You know what's going to happen sometimes. You know the tragedy at the end for your team, usually. And yet you watch it. And everyone acts as though they are performing this spectacle. And I also discovered, that cricket works as a game for all of you cricketers, but it also works on a different level completely. It's an art form that photographers love. If you look at photography of sports, you have all sorts of pictures of footballers, right? All of that stuff. It's just snaps, actually. But you look at a photographer who photographs cricketers, and you realize it's a completely different art form. It's always composed. If you have a picture of a bowler, you'll see, it's perfect balance. And the art form is brought to it, and I just love that. And so my character in this book is a person who doesn't play cricket, is not a very good photographer, nothing like that, but he gets kind of obsessed with both. And he tries to discover why he likes cricket, what this allegiance you might have to a team. Why do you support a team, particularly teams that lose? But there is a kind of bond of loss, I guess, that people go for. And he also tries to become a photographer, and those two kind of come together in his life. So in a sense, I wanted that story to come out. Yeah.
Would you like to read us a section from The Match? Have we got time just for a little bit?
Yeah, I can read. This is. The Match starts out actually. I'm writing about two things I hadn't written about before. One is a sport, which is cricket, but it's not a cricketer's book, though actually the cricketers Wisden reviewed it and seemed to like it a lot. And there are a couple of things in there. It also starts off in the Philippines, which is probably one of the few countries that don't play cricket. But I wanted to write about the Philippines, where I'd lived for a long time as well. So I kind of put both challenges together. And it's one of those books where I think I'm not an autobiographical writer. I don't use my own personal experience very often, but I've realized that I do sometimes. So in Reef, for example, there is one bit that is absolutely autobiographical, which is the beginning. And in this book, in the match, which is that one, there are 2 or 3 copies left, I think. There's
So get them quickly.
I know because I brought them. There is one real match in it. So, I mean, I got very obsessed in cricket. This was back in whenever it was, 2002. I was planning to write Prisoner of Paradise, and I got sidetracked into this book. And then I did go and watch cricket matches and all of that sort of stuff. It was before the IPL and this 24-hour cricket, so it was much more manageable. And this is a thing which came out of a match at the Oval, where Sri Lanka is playing India in a one-day match. And some of it is true. I won't bother to tell you. We can talk about it later, maybe. But I'll read you just a section.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll cut around and try and bring it into a short piece. But it's the Oval. Sonny is my character. He's a middle-aged guy. He's got a son who's 15, and partly cricket is a way of trying to connect with his son, who doesn't particularly want to play cricket either, but has happened to be, I think is maybe at the same match or something. Sri Lanka is playing India. And it's not like the usual matches you find in England. Sri Lanka batted first. It wasn't a good start. Wickets fell fast. But the play was for runs, runs, runs. Everything cautious was booed. Sonny was in a stand mostly full of Indian supporters, with a small contingent of Sri Lankans 2 rows back. There were trumpets and drum rolls, klaxons and whistles and rattles and chants and screams. This was cricket at full decibel, a game where every ball was a missile, and the field an arena of gladiators. Sonny realized he had known nothing about real cricket. Nothing. By 11:30, the Sri Lankan captain was out, caught by Dravid, to a huge roar. "Ooh, ah, India!" was chanted again and again, until 15 minutes later, another wicket fell. Then a new, more menacing chant. "Are you watching Pakistan? Are you watching Pakistan?" India had come from a win over England the day before. The fans were on a roll. They had Pakistan in their sights. The commentator among the Sri Lankan family clicked his tongue and poured himself some wine. "What has happened?" he moaned. "In 1996, we were the champions of the world. What the hell has gone wrong?" I'm going to skip a little bit and come to when India's batting. Then Tendulkar stepped forward and smashed a long, hard drive. The ball, a round white bullet, shot across the grass towards a few fat pigeons congregated on an empty patch of the ground. The birds were pecking at the earth and waddling about, ignoring the mad, momentous game around them, unaware of the tribal needs, the chameleon identities, the laws of science, and the art of hitting ducks. The ball sped into their midst and caused a flurry. The bird in the middle didn't stand a chance. The ball hit it. The pigeon keeled over. Play stopped. The whole of the oval was hushed. The nearest fielder walked over and picked up the bird as though it were a dove of peace. He carried it slowly towards the boundary. Sonny knew then that this was the picture for him. He ran down to the rope faster than a long leg might streak to a stop boundary board. He kept the lens aperture small, knowing that in his photograph, the sky would be a bowl where newspaper confetti floated like circling buzzards, while in the center, a pair of clasped hands prayed to a dying bird. Its feathers trembled just enough to blur in and out of perfect focus, like life itself. He clicked the shutter before the groundsman bucket swung into view to collect the corpse. He didn't even need a light meter. There was something significant happening here. He knew, no matter what the outcome of the game would be, perhaps it was the power to silence that comes with death, however small the life, and our need to overcome it, to find some brief moment of care, hope, the tender possibility of renewal. This man, this game, this bird was salvation. The timing was perfect. Anything seemed possible. Peace, love, joy, life everlasting. It was all in the frame.
Thank you.
And yes, Tendulkar did hit this ball, and this pigeon did die. And what was really, really amazing, and again for fiction writers here, you might be interested, I was there at the match. Of course, I didn't take a picture of the pigeon. I didn't run down. I stood there thinking about it, and watching the Sri Lankans passing the wine around, and there's another chant that goes on about who is an Indian in that thing, because suddenly the whole atmosphere changed from everyone supporting India to suddenly everyone started supporting Sri Lanka. For no reason at all. And that was really, really interesting. But at one point, much later, the TLS ran a review of the book, a very nice review. And they, in the review, right in the center, they got a picture, and they managed to find a picture of the fielder carrying off, I think it was Mahela Jayawardena, carrying off this pigeon from the field. And it was like fiction and reality, really just rubbing up against each other.
That seems a very good point to move on to your recent work and
Okay.
your cycle of stories, Noontide Toll. I mean, epigraphs seem to be very important in all your books, actually.
Oh, I spent so much time on those,
I
not
know,
nothing on the books.
absolutely,
You know.
but no, you mentioned the one for the match, you know, and I think it was a photograph freezes a moment. It also establishes memory,
Yeah.
and this idea of memory and the archive of memory seems to be at the core. How do you
Well-
write Sri Lanka now? And Noontide Toll is really, seems to me, a very challenging collection, a cycle really of stories linked through the van man narrator Vasantha, which you are able to create a multiplicity of perspectives on a war-torn or post-war-torn world. But that's a very challenging thing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I guess I'm very lucky. I've been quite lucky in the writing, but I'm also because this 30-year war, a very bruising war for a lot of psyches, not just Sri Lankan psyches. I think, you know, for people who have been there, have seen it, or even from afar, just as any violence, what's happening at the moment all over the world, you know, it does bruise all of us, and it does something to us. When the war came to an end, it came to an end in a very difficult way, let me put it that way. It's very contentious how it came to an end, what happened. No one quite has established to everyone's satisfaction anyway as to what happened. Basically, the Tamil Tigers, the LTT, were defeated by the Sri Lankan army and this last push happened at a time where lots of people were pushed into certain areas. There were no fire zones, which turned out to be possibly fire zones. No one knows how many people died, how many innocent people died, how many civilians died. There have been talk about war crimes. There have been talk about that being too much. So it's a very murky, difficult area. And this came to an end, you know, now, what, 9 years ago. And the period immediately after the end of the war was a difficult period where people didn't really want to talk too much about what had happened or what might happen. There was a sense of triumphalism. There was a sense of difficulty to talk about certain things. And I know writers living in Sri Lanka were finding it difficult to talk about things, or there was a sense of required silence. Sri Lanka's also had, like I'm beginning to discover everywhere, a huge thing about amnesia. I mean, we heard about it yesterday.
Jacob Ross, yeah, yeah.
And also to do with Britain as well. You know, there is an amnesia about history. It's a way that people and societies cope, perhaps, or not cope. And I kind of wanted to somehow deal with this moment after the end of a very traumatic period and trying to work out how you deal with it and how you put that into fiction. And for me, the challenge there was to make a fiction that was relevant to the moment, in the moment, as well as something that could be read later. And as time goes on, hopefully read even much, much, much later. And so I ended up with a van driver who goes around the country into places he had never been before because of the war. So he goes to the north where really most of the fighting took place, though there was violence everywhere on the island.
5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So his journey is to see these places and talk about it in his own way, trying to work out how to deal with memory. Yeah.
And he's kind of, he's a bit like the narrator, isn't he, in
He's
a way?
the narrator, yeah, it's his book. And I don't know, shall I read
a bit from that? Yeah.
Shall I I know we're
we'd
running
like
out.
we're running out of time, but we'd like to open it. It's a wonderful book, and it's,
I'm trying to read the
I
shortest
mean, the
bit
balance of how you write trauma, and
Yeah, okay, I'll just try and quickly skip through. I mean, the beginning of it, I mean, basically he's a van driver who carries tourists, but also other people. You know, it's a van for hire, as you can get here as well, I'm sure. So it begins with a very short story called Full Tank, and it ends with another short story called Running on Empty. And he's basically, in this first one, he's going up to the north where he hasn't been before. It's Jaffna, it's the north of the country. It's where a lot of the fighting was at one point. But he's been a couple of times, and I'll just read a little bit of it. Every time I drive across the causeway to Jaffna, I feel I'm entering another country. A lagoon is as big as a sea. The sky touches it at the edge on the left and on the right, and the wind makes ripples look like waves. The fellows at the checkpoint know me so well now they don't even look at my ID. They crack a couple of jokes about the state of my van, laugh their heads off. I tell them it's a Japanese van. In 1945, Japan was a dump. Nobody thought Japanese could make even a cup of tea anymore. But now, Toyota is the biggest car company in the world. It's a funny business, I tell them. No one knows who'll have the last laugh. Look at Germany, same thing. They're rolling in it now. Makes you think about defeat and victory. Today, I'm a van man for Mrs. Curre and 2 Hollanders. I get some oddballs, but these are the oddest I've had. She's from the Heritage Agency. When I tell the 2 tourists that I retired a few years ago at 55 to start this business with the van, they're astounded. Fucking hell, Mr. Benton from Brighton said. His language surprised me. But that's the way this new breed of tourists talk nowadays, even when they're flip-flopping in their mid-60s and should know the risks of a loose mouth and all that. They come from such developed countries, but they have to stay in service until they lose their marbles. Then they come here on a tight budget, looking for, something. Sometimes I think the way the world is organized is a joke. I'll stop there, otherwise we're going to completely run out of time.
We should stop. I think one of the most wonderful things about it is the combination of the way in which the kind of lightness of touch, but dealing with these questions, but not in any sense dismissing them, which are so urgent and so pressing. Can we open it for 2 questions, maybe, or 3? Thank you. Yes.
In your reading on cricket, one is seduced into asking this question, which you did run at. What has
speak
gone
up a little
wrong?
bit?
What has gone wrong with Sri Lankan cricket?
Oh my goodness. I'm sure politics has something to do with it. But I don't know the answer. Maybe it's because I'm not watching it enough. But you know, when I was writing that book, I watched a lot of cricket, and as I'm sure many of you recognize this feeling, you do get kind of hyper trying to work out. Even though it doesn't matter, it's only a game, you know, but still you get worked up. And then when they started playing cricket all the time, every day, somewhere in the world, you can watch cricket all the time, I realized it's too unhealthy to keep watching. So I've stopped. But I don't know what's gone wrong. But things go up, things go down. Happened for the West Indies.
Okay. Shall we stop there? I think you're saying time's up unless there's a burning question from anybody.
Let's have just one more question.
One more question.
You have to be a little rebellious.
Anybody?
No?
No?
No? Okay.
I'm sure Romesh would be happy to sign books if there are any still available out there after the session. I think there's a space out there.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,